He bought a cabin in the middle of nowhere just to be alone, to forget, to survive the silence. But when Elias McCrae arrived in the snowy wilderness of Wind River, Wyoming, someone was already living in the home he'd never seen. A woman with haunted eyes, a quiet strength, and a secret that would change everything. Why didn't she run when he opened the door? Why did the smoke rise from a chimney no one claimed? And why, when the law finally came calling, did Elias find himself willing to kill for someone he'd just met? This isn't just a tale about the Wild West. It's a story about what's left behind after the gunfire ends. About love growing from the ashes of grief. About a woman who refused to be broken. And a man who thought he had nothing left to give. By the time the snow melts, this cabin will hold more than shelter. It will carry the weight of redemption, of justice, and the beginnings of a family neither of them ever planned for. If you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and stories that heal, like share and subscribe, and now, let's begin the story. Elias McCrae had lost everything a man could lose: his land, his family, and the last thread of reason that once held his world together. All he had left now was a deed folded into the inside pocket of his coat, and a worn leather saddle carrying what little else remained. Somewhere deep in the Wind River wilderness, he'd been told, was a cabin small, forgotten, and cheap. A place where no one went, a place that might finally leave him alone. The ride had taken him longer than expected. Wyoming's late autumn winds didn't care about intentions, and neither did the biting cold that slipped through the seams of his gloves. Each mile into the backcountry felt like a reckoning. The air thinned with altitude, and the silence between the trees deepened until even the creak of his saddle seemed like a trespass. He had passed no other riders, no cabins, not even a fence post, just endless pines stretching up like hands reaching for a sky that didn't promise anything. He was tired, not just in body, but in the kind of way that made a man's bones feel older than his years. The kind of tired that comes after too much loss and not enough sleep. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 5 days. Hadn't wanted to. Words felt like luxuries now, and Elias had none to spare. But even tired as he was, he felt it before he saw it, that flicker of something out of place. At the edge of a narrow clearing, where the trees thinned into tall grass and broken brush, the cabin stood just as it had been described, crooked, slumped slightly to one side, but intact. A battered porch, half covered in frost, a roof patched with wood that didn't match, a single window with ragged curtains that looked like they'd been sewn from flour sacks. But what caught his attention first wasn't the structure. It was the thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney, rising into the still air like a question. Elias stopped his horse without a word. The animal tossed its head gently, sensing something its rider hadn't yet put into words. Smoke, fire, someone was here. His first thought was that the old hunter had never left, that the sale had been a swindle, and Elias had ridden all this way to fight over land that wasn't truly his. But no, he had the deed. It was real. The man had been hurt, his leg ruined. He'd barely stood upright when Elias gave him the money. Still, there was no mistaking it. Someone was inside that cabin, and they were warm. Elias dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from the ride. His boots hit the frozen earth with a dull crunch, and he took a deep breath of pine and smoke and the faintest hint of yeast on the wind. Bread. Someone inside was baking bread. That stopped him cold. People didn't bake unless they meant to stay. This wasn't just a traveler seeking shelter. Whoever was inside had made themselves at home. His hand brushed the outline of the folded deed in his pocket, but the paper felt suddenly flimsy, like a claim that might dissolve the moment it was questioned. Still, he climbed the 2 steps to the porch and stood before the door. The wood beneath his boots groaned, announcing him. Through the small window, light flickered orange from a fire inside. Shadows moved slowly. He didn't knock. The door was unlatched, and it opened with a reluctant creak. Warmth met him first, washing over his face in waves. It smelled like hearth smoke and rising dough, and something sharper, juniper maybe, or the dried herbs hanging in neat bundles by the doorframe. Inside, The cabin was smaller than he expected, but not cramped. Every surface was tidy. A rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove with a kettle set slightly off-center, a line of washed clothes drying near the fire. And standing by the stove, one hand resting on the edge of a ceramic bowl, was a woman. She was tall, or maybe the room was just small. Her back was to him, her dark hair tied into a braid that had come loose at the ends. She wore a faded gray shawl that hung low across her arms. Her posture was relaxed, not startled, not bracing, just calm, as if she had been expecting him. Elias didn't speak. His hand hovered near his coat, not for the deed now, but for reassurance. She turned before he could say a word. Her face was pale from winter, not fear. Her eyes steady, dark, unreadable, met his without surprise. She didn't move, didn't flinch, only studied him like someone who already knew how this would go. The silence stretched. Elias felt something shift in his chest, a strange tightness that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with confusion. This wasn't a trespasser. She didn't carry herself like someone hiding. She stood like someone who belonged. Still, his jaw clenched. The words were slow to come, stuck somewhere beneath the ache of the long ride and the flicker of uncertainty. He had expected to find a place abandoned. Instead, he'd walked into something alive. And then she spoke, her voice low, almost kind. "I knew you'd come, that was all." And Elias McCrae, tired, weathered, nearly hollow, stood at the threshold of a home that was supposed to be his, and realized he had no idea what story he had just stepped into. Most strangers flinch, explain, or flee. They stammer apologies, rush to gather their things, or raise their hands in guilt or shame. But this woman, this Mara Delaney, had done none of that. She hadn't trembled or justified. She hadn't looked down or away. Instead, she'd stood in the flickering warmth of the hearth like someone who had always been there, like the house itself had grown up around her. And that was the first moment Elias understood she wasn't hiding. She belonged to something he didn't yet understand. The rest of that afternoon passed in the hush of unspoken tension. Elias didn't unpack his saddlebags. He didn't ask her to leave. He didn't speak unless necessary. But he watched quietly, deliberately, the way a man does when he isn't sure whether what he's witnessing is a miracle or a mistake. Mara moved through the small cabin with a familiarity that couldn't be faked. Her hands knew every shelf, every drawer, every creaky floorboard. She added a log to the fire without hesitation, stirred the stew again as if the pot had been simmering for hours, set 2 bowls on the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. The cloth she used to cover the table was old but clean, embroidered with uneven blue stitching, a hand-stitched border of wildflowers. He recognized the kind, Wyoming blooms, the kind that don't grow without struggle. The smell of baked bread lingered in the air, buttery and warm, its crust resting on a wooden board beside a small crock of butter. Real butter. Churned. Not bought. There were 2 cups already filled with water from the basin, placed at opposite ends of the table, as if she'd known he was coming, as if dinner wasn't a coincidence, but a routine already set in motion. Elias sat down slowly, his back stiff from the cold, his mind still turning over questions. She joined him without ceremony, no welcome, no apology. Just a quiet acceptance that he was now part of the space she occupied. Her face was clearer now, in the soft lantern light. She looked about 35, with lines around her mouth, not from laughter, but from long silences. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back loosely again, with strands falling across her forehead. There was something about her presence measured, unhurried, that made Elias forget the weeks he'd spent riding alone. They ate in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire and the soft scrape of spoon on bowl. The stew was rich with root vegetables and a hint of something wild rabbit, maybe. He didn't ask. He waited until after the dishes were rinsed and stacked to dry before asking her name. She told him Mara Delaney without looking up. When he asked where she came from, she simply said, "Nowhere I'd go back to," He didn't press. She didn't offer more. Later, Elias stood near the fireplace, his fingers absently resting on the mantel. He hadn't removed his coat. He wasn't ready to call this home. Not yet. His eyes wandered, taking in the signs of life that weren't his. There was a stack of split wood arranged neatly by the stove, more than enough to get through the coming week. A small rocking chair sat by the window, with a quilt folded across the back. Next to it, on the windowsill, sat a chipped porcelain cup holding dried lavender stems. Nothing about this place felt temporary. Whoever Mara Delaney was, she hadn't come here to pass through. She'd come to stay. Elias turned to face her again. She stood by the drying rack, folding the cloth from dinner with methodical care. He finally asked what had been circling his thoughts all evening. "Why are you here?" She paused for just a moment, then answered without turning. "Because I can't leave." He waited for more, but nothing came. It wasn't fear in her voice. It wasn't defiance either. It was something harder to name: finality, maybe. As if leaving was not just impossible, but wrong. As if the cabin, for all its crooked walls and patched roof, was the last place on earth where she could stand still. That night, Elias spread his bedroll near the hearth. He didn't ask for the bed, and she didn't offer it. She took the small back room behind the curtain, closing it without a word. He lay awake, listening to the wind slip through the chinks in the cabin walls, the pop of pine sap in the fire, the low creak of wood as the cold settled deeper into the logs. Sometime past midnight, he noticed the light. A faint glow leaked from beneath the curtain, and the soft shadow of movement danced across the floor. She was still awake. He could hear the shift of fabric, the slow pacing of footsteps. No crying, no whispered prayers, just movement, as if sleep wasn't safe. He stared at the ceiling until his eyes blurred. At some point, he rolled onto his side and caught sight of something he hadn't noticed earlier. Her shawl hung on a peg near the door, and next to it on a small wooden hook was a pair of gloves. One had slipped halfway off the peg, revealing the inside seam, and there, faint but undeniable, was the shadow of a bruise. It wrapped around the inside of the wrist, faded but unmistakable, the kind of mark that lingered long after ropes were cut. The kind of wound that didn't come from work or winter. Elias stared at it for a long time. He felt something clench low in his chest, not anger yet, not even suspicion, just a deep, unsettling knowing. When morning came, he would ask again. But for now, the wind rose outside, rattling the window pane, and far in the distance, from somewhere deep within the trees, a lone wolf howled into the dark. Elias didn't sleep. Snow reveals more than it hides. It may fall soft, may hush the world beneath a white blanket, but it never truly conceals. The morning sun had only begun to stretch its fingers across the ridge when Elias stepped outside and saw it the truth, pressed clear into the frost-covered earth. 2 sets of tracks. They circled the cabin in a wide, deliberate loops. Heavy boot prints, too large for Mara, too calculated for coincidence. The steps didn't meander. They didn't stray toward the trees or back toward the trail. They moved with purpose, staying just outside the reach of firelight and windows. And what chilled Elias more than the presence of the tracks was their absence in the other direction. No return path, no sign anyone had walked away. He knelt beside the nearest impression, gloved hand brushing the edge of the print, deep set, recent. Maybe from the night before, or even this morning. Before the sun climbed high enough to soften the frost, his heart thudded against his ribs, slow and hard, like warning drums in the quiet. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Mara stepped out, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked toward the woods first, her gaze sweeping the edge of the tree line like someone used to scanning for threats. Then her eyes fell on the ground beside him, on the tracks. Her breath caught slightly, just enough for Elias to notice. But her face stayed composed. "They didn't knock," Elias said, though it came out more bitter than intended. "No," she replied softly. "They wouldn't." He rose to stand beside her, his eyes still fixed on the prints. We should check the perimeter, he added. But Mara, without looking at him, shook her head. Not today. We stay inside? Elias turned to her, brows drawn. You think they're still out there? She didn't answer, not with words, but she didn't have to. There was something in the way she looked at the trees, some quiet certainty that whoever had come was not finished with them yet. And Elias, for all his instincts and years of reading men's motives, found himself nodding in agreement. Back inside, the cabin felt smaller. The fire had burned low, so he knelt to stir the embers and add fresh wood. The heat returned slowly, chasing the cold from his fingertips, but not from the base of his spine. That kind of cold was made of something else. Dread. Maybe. Memory. Mara moved about the room with her usual quiet efficiency. She ladled oatmeal into 2 bowls, added a handful of dried apples from a jar, and placed 1 bowl in front of him at the table. No words, no explanation. Just a routine that had clearly been hers long before Elias arrived. They ate in silence for a while. It was Mara who spoke first, her voice low and even, as if discussing the weather. I used to live in Red Hollow. Elias's spoon froze mid-air. Red Hollow. A name carved deep into the back of his memory. A small mining town, south of here, nestled between 2 jagged hills, barely marked on most maps. The kind of place where law bent with the wind and power belonged to the loudest voice in the saloon. I left a year ago, she continued, stirring her oatmeal absently. Or tried to. Elias forced himself to speak carefully, to keep the tension from cracking through. You left someone behind. Mara gave a faint, tired smile. I wouldn't call it that. She stared into her bowl for a moment before continuing. He was the kind of man who didn't take no for an answer. Owned the mine, the town council, half the deputies. And when my father got sick and couldn't pay his debts, well, there weren't many options. Elias's hand curled slowly around his spoon. The name came to his lips before she said it. A name he hadn't spoken in over 2 years. Silas Hardin, Mara said quietly, and just like that, something old and buried shifted inside Elias. A crack opened in the shell he'd built around the part of himself that used to believe in justice. Silas Hardin, the man who'd controlled Red Hollow like a private kingdom. The same man Elias's younger brother, Samuel, had tried to stand up to and died for. Shot on a trail just north of town. Officially ruled a robbery. Blamed on faceless bandits. But Elias had never believed that. And now, sitting across from this woman with shadows behind her eyes, he knew his doubts had never been wrong. He didn't say Samuel's name. Didn't ask Mara if she knew about the man who died protecting a family that had refused to sell their land to Silas. There was no need to drag that pain out now. Not yet. Instead, he let the silence stretch. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the bare branches. Somewhere in the forest, something stirred just out of sight, just beyond safety. You think he sent someone? Elias asked finally. Mara nodded once. He always sends someone, and you've been here. How long? She exhaled slowly. Almost 6 months. I thought he'd given up. Elias wanted to ask why she'd stayed, why she hadn't kept moving, but the answer was there, in the way she stared at the floorboards, as if they were the only things holding her upright. She was tired, tired in the way only hunted people get. After breakfast, Elias walked to the far end of the cabin, where an old chest sat beneath the narrow window. He had noticed it on his first night, but hadn't bothered to open it. It didn't belong to him, not truly. This whole place, deed or not, had felt borrowed since the moment he walked in. But now, something tugged at him. He opened the lid. Inside, beneath a wool blanket and a broken lantern, was a folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges, with smudged ink and a few water stains. A hand-drawn map, crude but detailed. It showed the surrounding woods, a river bend, the slope of a ridge. A small X marked a spot labeled Ridge Creek Pass, and beside it, written in a steady hand, for whoever finds this watch for Silas. Elias stared at the name. The ink barely faded. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was convergence, something deeper, something personal. He turned the map over, but there was nothing else. Just that name, just that warning. Behind him. Mara moved quietly near the stove, unaware of what he'd found. Or maybe not. Elias folded the map slowly, placed it into his coat pocket, and closed the chest. Whatever story he had walked into, it had just become his own. Not all ghosts wear chains. Some ride horses, carrying silence and sin in their saddlebags. And that morning, 3 shadows came riding down the ridge with dust in their wake and fire in their eyes. Elias had risen early, as always. He was chopping kindling just off the side of the cabin when he heard the thudding rhythm of hooves on frozen dirt. Not a slow trot, not a casual ride. This was purposeful, pressed, too fast for hunters, too direct for wanderers. Then came the sound that made his chest tighten, a whistle, 2 short notes, rising, then one long, like a call across canyons or between men who'd spent too many nights around fires not their own. Elias had heard it once before, years ago, in a place he never meant to revisit. He turned toward the sound. The ridge beyond the pines was lit by a shaft of morning sun, catching on 3 silhouettes cresting the rise. 3 riders. Men with the kind of posture that spoke of violence made routine. One in the lead, straight-backed and slow with his reins, like a man who never feared needing to run. The others flanked him loosely, one heavy-set, the other twitchy and lean, both armed and alert. Elias felt the chill creep down his spine and turned back toward the cabin. Mara met him at the door. She hadn't needed to ask. She'd heard it too. Her hands were at her sides, but her fingers trembled, curling into her palms. "Stay inside," Elias said, voice low, but she shook her head. "They've come for me." He grabbed her wrist not roughly, but firmly. "Then don't make it easy." She hesitated, looked past his shoulder at the trees, the rising dust, the shapes growing clearer. She seemed to fold inward slightly, then turned and disappeared into the cabin's shadows. Elias stepped out to meet them. The horses came to a halt just yards from the porch. Dust settled slowly behind them, like ash after a blaze. The lead rider dismounted first. He moved with a casual grace, unhurried, like a man who knew every moment belonged to him unless someone dared take it. Silas Hardin. His hair had gone grayer, but the eyes were the same dark as gunmetal, unreadable, and cold. He wore a long wool coat, dusty at the hem, and a pistol low on his hip that had seen more action than most lawmen ever did. The smile he gave Elias was thin, controlled. "Mornin'," he said, tipping his hat like this was a neighborly visit. Elias nodded once, tight. "Can I help you?" Silas looked past him at the cabin. "Fine place you've got here, bit remote, but cozy, private." Elias replied, "Of course." Silas's eyes flicked to the side windows, then back. "You must be the new owner, Elias McCrae." "Is it?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't ask how Silas knew his name. Men like that always knew more than they should. "Mind if we come in out of the cold?" Silas asked, though his tone made it clear the question was just habit. Elias held his ground. "This is my land, my cabin. You didn't write ahead." Silas smiled again, broader this time. "Now, don't be inhospitable. We're just passing through. Thought we'd say hello. Maybe share a cup of something warm." Behind him, the twitchy man dismounted and began circling the porch's edge like a dog sniffing for an open door. Elias's hand drifted to the grip of the axe he'd left in the chopping block. Then the third man spoke, his voice gravel and spit. "Heard this place had a woman's touch." Elias didn't blink. "You heard wrong?" But just then, the door behind him creaked. Mara stood in the doorway. She hadn't changed from the morning's same shawl, same quiet strength, but her face was paler now. Her eyes locked on Silas, and in that moment, every ounce of stillness inside her turned brittle. Silas's smile didn't change. "There she is," he said, as if greeting someone he'd left sleeping in his bed that morning. "My wife." The words hit Elias harder than a bullet. He turned, saw Mara's lips part barely, But no sound came. She didn't deny it. Not yet. But the way her fingers clutched the doorframe told him everything. This was no marriage born of love or choice. Silas stepped forward. Elias moved between them without thinking. "She's not your wife," he said. Silas raised an eyebrow. "That's a mighty bold claim to make. Stranger, she's here of her own will. She's safe. For now." Silas replied. His voice was still smooth, but the edge beneath it had sharpened. "But you see, that woman owes me more than a safe place. She's my property, bought fair and square." Elias clenched his jaw. "People ain't property." Silas's smile returned, almost amused. "You one of those men who believes in ideals. Thought those died out after the war. Some things don't die easy." For a moment, the air felt stretched, thin, as if the cabin itself held its breath. Then, without another word, Mara stepped back into the cabin and closed the door behind her. The sound was soft, final. Silas chuckled, but the mirth never reached his eyes. "She always was stubborn," he said. "Tried to run twice before. Thought hiding in the hills would change things. But women like her, they always get tired of the cold. And when they do, they remember who feeds them, who owns them." Elias didn't answer. He stood still, eyes level with Silas, waiting. The other two men shifted slightly expectant, ready. But Silas held up a hand. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll be on our way for now. Just wanted to say hello. Make sure the roof wasn't leaking. I've got a stake in the place. After all." "You've got nothing here," Elias said. Silas's eyes glittered. "We'll see." He turned, walked slowly back to his horse, mounted with a practiced ease. The others followed, but not before giving Elias a long, assessing look. As they rode away, kicking up the same dust they'd brought, Elias stood rooted to the porch. Behind him, the door opened again. He didn't turn, not yet. Mara's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have done that." He breathed out slowly. "He called you his wife. I never chose him," she said. "But the law doesn't care what I chose." Elias turned finally, saw the weight in her posture, the ache in her eyes, and something else, to a spark, not anger, not fear, something like resolve. The cabin's silence returned slowly, interrupted only by the soft creak of wood and the whisper of pine branches in the wind. Elias closed the door behind them, locked it, and for the first time, he understood this wasn't just a woman seeking shelter. This was a fight neither of them had truly prepared for, but it had already begun. They said justice was a sheriff's badge and a court's verdict. But out here, in the pine-shadowed wild, justice looked more like a man with shaking hands reaching for a gun, and another ready to die for what was right. By dusk, the cold had turned sharper, more brittle, as if the wind itself sensed something in the air. The sky had dimmed to a steel gray, and the fire in the cabin's hearth flickered weakly, as if unsure it should still be burning. Elias stood by the window, watching the pines sway. His shoulders still ached where tension had settled like a stone. He hadn't spoken much since Silas left that morning. Neither had Mara. Until now. She stepped beside him, her voice low. "He'll come back tonight?" Elias didn't look away from the trees. "I know. He'll burn it down if I don't go." He finally turned, saw the quiet resignation in her face, but behind it, something else? Not fear, not entirely. Something closer to weariness. "I'm not letting that happen," Elias said. Mara looked down, then slowly reached for his hand. She placed it gently against her stomach. He stilled. It was faint, just a curve barely visible through her dress, but undeniable. She nodded once, as if confirming something unspoken. "He's not Silas's," she said. "He belonged to someone who saw me, who loved me, before Silas took it all away." Elias withdrew his hand slowly, as if afraid to break something fragile. "Does he know he asked? He suspects?" Mara said. "It's why he's here." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant echo of hooves. They both heard it. Elias moved to the door, rifle in hand, but Mara stopped him. "No more running," she said. "This ends tonight." The fire outside came first a warning. One of Silas's men had tossed a torch onto the edge of the woodpile near the barn. Flames licked up the dry edges, sending sparks into the twilight. They weren't trying to burn it down yet. They wanted fear to do the work first. Then Silas rode up alone, a silhouette against the firelight, his horse snorting clouds into the cold. He dismounted slowly, with deliberate calm, and approached the porch where Elias waited. "You've had your time," Silas called. "Send her out. She's not going anywhere," Elias said. Silas tilted his head. "Then you've made your choice." Elias stepped forward, rifle lowered but firm in his grip. "You want her? You come through me." Silas smiled. Something wolfish. "Is that how we're doing this? No more threats. No more men with guns in the shadows." Elias said, "Just you and me?" Silas laughed. "A duel. That's a young man's game, or a desperate one." Silas considered, looked around at the flames smoldering in the distance, at the quiet cabin behind Elias, and the woman just visible in the window. Something in his jaw shifted. "All right," he said. "You want frontier justice? Fine by me." He unbuckled his coat, revealing the pistol at his side. 10 paces. Then we see who wants her more. The clearing was quiet. The trees, the snow, even the wind held their breath. They faced each other, 10 paces apart. Each man knew the other's history. Each held more than a gun. They held memory, regret, fire. Elias exhaled once, slow and steady. His fingers twitched. Silas smirked. Ready, hero. The word barely passed his lips before both men moved. 2 shots cracked through the trees. Birds scattered from the pines. Elias staggered, clutching his side. Pain bloomed white-hot. But Silas fell. He hit the snow hard, his pistol skidding from his hand. He gasped once loud, angry, but the sound faded as blood spread through his coat. For a moment, Elias could only hear the ringing in his ears. Then the sharp report of another shot closer. He turned, just in time to see Mara standing on the porch, holding his rifle. One of Silas's men, Clem, the twitchy one, lay in the snow. His pistol dropped, his chest rising and falling with ragged, stunned breaths. She had fired. She had saved him. Elias dropped to one knee, breath hitching. His side burned, hot and wet. The cold air bit at the wound, and he felt his vision blur. Mara ran to him. She dropped beside him, her hands pressed to his wound. Blood seeped through her fingers, but she didn't flinch. "You're going to be all right," she said, but her voice trembled. For all her strength, this was the first time the mask cracked. He reached up, brushed her cheek. "You fired that shot." She nodded, tears forming now. "I had to. He was going to. I couldn't let him take you too." In the background, the last of Silas's men was retreating. He mounted fast and rode off toward the trees, perhaps to find reinforcements, perhaps to vanish. But Elias couldn't focus. Everything narrowed. Mara's face, her touch, the heat of blood mixing with snow. "You're safe now," he whispered. "No," she said, "not yet." Because from the ridge, there came another sound. More horses. The ground trembled slightly as they approached, at least 4, maybe 5, shapes cutting through the trees, dark against the snow. Mara looked up, shielding her eyes. Elias tried to rise, but the pain forced him back down. "Go!" he rasped. "Hide!" "No!" she said. "Not this time." The fire still burned behind them. Silas's body lay cooling in the snow. The world had shifted, and neither of them knew yet which way it would tilt. But they were not the same as before. She was not the same. In the distance, the rhythm of hooves was steady and relentless, like a second storm rolling in. But this one didn't carry snow. It carried lawmen. Or worse, men wearing the badge but serving the dead man on the ground. Elias lay on the wooden floor near the hearth, his shirt soaked with blood, but his eyes sharp and alert. Mara had done what she could, bandaged the wound with strips torn from a linen curtain, boiled water over the fire, pressed cloth to his side, but the bleeding had slowed only slightly. Her hands trembled, stained crimson, some of it Silas's, some of it Elias's, and some of it her own, though the wound was invisible, buried deeper than any knife could reach. They had barely caught their breath when the sound came. Hooves, 5, maybe 6 horses. No shouting, no urgency, just that slow, even thunder of authority approaching. Elias gritted his teeth as he tried to sit up, but Mara pressed a hand to his chest. "Don't," she whispered. "You need to stay still." He reached beneath the cot, dragging forward a small iron box, one they'd found on Silas's body. Hidden beneath his coat, Mara had opened it just before she began treating Elias. Inside were folded letters, documents, receipts, records of bribes, blackmail, land swindles, and names. One name repeated more than once, Sheriff Cole Mathers. Elias handed her the box with a grimace. "You hold this now." Mara blinked. "Me? If I'm dead by morning, it still needs to reach someone honest." She held the box close to her chest, as if it weighed more than steel. Then the riders came into view. There were 5 of them, just as Elias had counted. The man in front was unmistakable thick mustache, long duster coat, and a badge glinting at his chest. Sheriff Cole Mathers. Behind him, 4 others, one of them the same man who had fled the cabin after Silas fell. His shoulder was bandaged, but his smirk remained. The horses halted outside. Mathers dismounted slowly, scanning the scene, burned-out fire pit, drag marks in the snow, Silas Webb's body lying just feet from the porch. The rifle Mara had fired still rested beside the door. The sheriff took his time. When he finally knocked, it was with 3 heavy raps that seemed to echo through the bones of the house. Mara opened the door. For a long moment, no one said a word. Elias, propped weakly on one elbow, stared at the sheriff with cold, guarded eyes. Mathers looked past Mara, past the rifle, and settled on the wounded man by the hearth. Then his gaze dropped to the box in Mara's arms. He stepped inside, hat in hand, boot heels heavy against the floorboards. Behind him, the wounded deputy hovered at the door, eyes darting between Mara and the box. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "looks like you had yourselves a night." Neither of them answered. Mathers looked at Silas's body again, then slowly walked over to it. He crouched, turned the corpse with practiced ease, and nodded once as if confirming something. "You know," he said, almost conversational, "I never liked that man anyway." Mara stiffened. Elias's hand drifted closer to the pistol at his side, though his fingers were unsteady. The sheriff stood. He made messes, expected others to clean them up, thought money could do anything. Mathers glanced at Mara, didn't expect a woman to be the one to stop him. Elias narrowed his eyes. "Then you'll do the right thing." Mathers turned toward him. "I'll do a thing. Whether it's right depends on the story I hear." He pointed at the box in Mara's arms. "And whether what's in there matches what I already know." The air in the cabin was thick now, not with smoke, but tension. It clung to every surface. Mara clutched the box tighter. "So, what happens now?" she asked. The sheriff sighed. "It's late. We'll ride out at dawn, back to Red Hollow. You're taking us in?" Elias asked, his voice rough with pain. "Protocol," Mathers said. "Dead man, gunfire, injured deputy. Has to be questions asked, papers signed." His tone was calm, but not comforting. "Until then," he added, glancing around, "no one leaves this cabin." He looked to his men and gave a curt nod. Set camp outside, no fire too close. They obeyed, wordlessly. Sheriff Mathers tipped his hat toward Mara before stepping out into the cold night once more. The door shut softly behind him, but the pressure lingered like a held breath. Mara knelt beside Elias again. His face was pale, but he was awake, watching her. "You shouldn't have told him about the box," she said. "I didn't. But he already knew something. He's not here for justice." She swallowed. "Then what do we do?" Elias's voice was faint. We wait, we hold on. And if morning brings hell, we bring the truth with us. Outside, the men were settling in. The horses snorted. Somewhere deeper in the trees, an owl called out. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked low. Mara didn't move. She held the box like a lifeline, her hands still streaked in fading blood. The snow softened every sound, but not the truth. It was in the box. It was in Mara's trembling hands. And soon, it would be in the hands of men who'd spent years pretending not to see what Silas truly was. By the time the fire in the hearth had burned to glowing embers, Mara had made her decision. With hands still streaked faintly from the night before, she placed the iron box on the cabin table. Sheriff Cole Mathers stood over it like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Elias sat nearby, propped by pillows, his breath still shallow, but steadier now. His wound was wrapped again. Clean linen, first sap, makeshift stitches. Pain didn't scare him. It never had. But what lay inside that box that terrified him? Not for himself, for what it might unleash. Mara unlatched the box. The room felt colder. Inside were the ghosts, stiff papers, marked with names and numbers, letters written in threats instead of ink. Contracts meant to bind, not protect. And in the center of it all, a folded map. Its corners burned as if someone had tried to destroy it, but failed. Mathers reached out and began to read. His eyes moved slowly, then faster. His lips tightened with each page turned. Elias watched him, noting every flinch, every breath caught in the throat. If even half of this is true, Mathers murmured. It's all true, Mara said. She placed one final piece on the table, a folded yellowing sheet, a marriage contract, handwritten, signed not by love, but coercion. My father was dying, Mara said. Silas offered to forgive our debts if I became his wife. He made me sign, then he made me disappear. Mathers didn't look at her. He stared at the paper as if it would rise up and bite him. Elias leaned forward. You remember a man named Samuel McCrae? Mathers nodded. Cattle rancher. Shot up on North Ridge last fall. They blamed rustlers. Elias's jaw tightened. He reached into the bag beside him and withdrew a silver pocket watch. He placed it beside the documents. The initials etched on the back SM shone faintly in the low light. He was my brother, Elias said. Silas bragged about it, said he taught him a lesson for refusing to sell water rights. Mathers stared at the watch. Time seemed to stop. That man controlled Red Hollow, Mara whispered, with money, fear, promises, and lies. The sheriff ran a hand through his graying hair. He looked older than he had the day before. You understand what this means? Elias nodded. You have a chance to set it right, or to bury it deeper than before. But if I take this to court, Mathers's voice dropped, almost to himself. Half the council will burn with him, including men I've known my whole life. They knew what he was, Elias said, voice rough, and they let it happen, Mara added gently. They'll burn either way. But this time, someone might finally feel warmth from the flames. The sheriff sat down slowly, as if gravity had become heavier. Let me think, he muttered. The room fell into silence again. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the land in a quiet that muffled everything but the truth. After a long moment, Mathers stood. You better come with us tomorrow, he said to Mara and Elias, because if what's in this box is what I think it is, there'll be more than fire in Red Hollow. He left the cabin without another word. Inside, the fire cracked again, low and steady. Elias exhaled and leaned back. His pain was real, but something deeper had lifted. Not relief, not yet, but direction. Mara picked up the pocket watch and held it a moment before returning it to Elias's hand. For Samuel, she said. For all of them, Elias replied. And outside, the storm deepened both in the sky and in the town they would soon return to. It had been years since Elias McCrae rode into a town with his head held high. But That morning, with blood dried on his coat and just as heavy in his saddlebags, he wasn't riding in alone. He rode beside a woman who refused to be owned and carried something worth more than revenge. The sky over the Wind River pines was low and gray, like the world had stopped breathing. Frost still clung to the branches, melting only in brief flashes of sunlight as they made their slow descent toward Red Hollow. Sheriff Mathers rode ahead, silent and tense. His two deputies flanked them, one with a wary eye on Elias, the other on Mara. They didn't speak much for the first few miles. The only sounds were the steady crunch of hooves through snow-packed soil and the occasional creak of leather saddles. But silence has weight when shared, and in that quiet rode a kind of fragile trust, one born not of history, but of everything survived the night before, midday. As the trail widened and the cold lifted slightly, Mara shifted in her saddle and broke the stillness. My father died a month after Silas took me. She said, never said goodbye, never asked me to forgive him, just died. Elias didn't answer right away. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the way her hands tightened around the reins, the way her voice stayed calm but carried a tremble at the edges. He thought he was saving you, Elias said eventually. He sold me, she replied, for peace of mind. Another stretch of silence followed, softer this time, more forgiving. I used to think that, Elias added, about my brother, that I'd failed him, that if I'd just ridden faster that day. He paused, jaw tightening against old guilt. We'd argued the week before, about cattle, water rights, nothing that mattered. I was stubborn. He was right. You couldn't have known, Mara said quietly. That doesn't make it hurt less. The trail wound through a narrow pass as dusk settled in. Sheriff Mathers raised a hand, signaling a stop. They'd make camp here, beneath a ridge of black pines, far from the warmth of any hearth. Elias moved stiffly, the wound in his side flaring as he dismounted. He refused help, though he winced as his boots hit the ground. Mara helped unpack supplies while the deputies gathered firewood. Before long, a modest fire crackled at the heart of the circle small, but enough. Later that night, Elias noticed Mara sitting slightly apart from the others, near the edge of camp. A scrap of cloth rested in her lap, and she was stitching it carefully under the flickering firelight. He walked over, slow and quiet. "What's that?" he asked. She held it up, a small shirt, barely big enough for a newborn. The seams were uneven, but there was care in every line. "Old feed sack," she said. "It's not much. It's something," Elias replied. She nodded. Then, after a pause, "I won't let this child grow up afraid." There was no pride in her voice, no drama, just steel, quiet, earned. Elias sat beside her, the fire casting shadows behind them. He watched the thread weave in and out, her fingers moving steadily despite the chill. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" she asked. "Still sewing?" He chuckled. That was the plan. "Buy a quiet cabin, live out my days talking to trees. Trees don't ask questions," she said. "They don't answer them either." Another silence. "Then, I wasn't just running from Silas," she confessed. "I was looking for a place that didn't know his name. A place this child could call home, not a hiding place. A beginning." Her voice cracked on the last word. She blinked quickly, looked down at the tiny shirt. Elias's chest tightened, not from the pain of his wound, from something deeper. "Recognition? We'll find it," he said. A breeze stirred the pine branches above. Sparks danced into the night. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. They just sat, shoulder to shoulder, as the fire burned low and the stars came out one by one. By dawn, the sky had cleared. The trail dipped below the last ridge, and there far below, Red Hollow emerged from the mist. Its rooftops and smoke trails looked peaceful from a distance, as if the sins they carried hadn't seeped into the soil. Elias pulled his horse to a stop at the crest, beside him. Mara took a long breath. "You ready, no?" Elias said. "But I'm going anyway." The Red Hollow courthouse hadn't changed much in 20 years. Its steps still groaned under weight, its door hinges still protested with rusted wines, and the inside smelled of old wood, dust, and the kind of whiskey men drank when they wanted to forget. But for Mara Delaney, what made her fingers tremble wasn't the building itself. It was the people inside, the rows of weathered faces that had once smiled at Silas Harden during town galas and harvest parades. Men who'd shaken his hand, laughed at his cruel jokes, and looked away when the whispers started. And now, here they sat, some with shame, others with suspicion, all waiting to see what kind of truth might crawl out of the shadows today. Elias McCrae stood beside her, shoulders squared, eyes steady. His arm still bore the marks of the bullet he took days before, and though his skin had paled from the pain, his voice had only grown stronger. Sheriff Cole Mathers stepped forward, a stack of documents in his weathered hands, receipts of debt collection, letters bearing Silas's handwriting, maps to illegal mining routes, and worst of all, the marriage contract that read more like a ransom note than a vow. The sheriff's voice didn't waver as he laid it all out. This woman was traded for debt, forced into a union with a man who had no regard for law, for consent, or for decency. And when she ran, he hunted her like a fugitive. Some men on the council shifted in their seats. Others looked away. Mara stepped up next. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm, steady tone filled the room like snowfall, soft but impossible to ignore. She told them about the night Silas made her father sign away her life, about the bruises that lasted longer than the apologies, about running, hiding, stitching scraps of peace together with every jar of preserved fruit and every fire tended at midnight, and finally, about the baby, a life growing inside her, untouched by Silas, born of love and carrying her last, best hope for something good. She never cried. She didn't beg. But when she paused, silence hung so thick in the air you could hear the crackle of the courthouse stove. The lawyer representing Silas's estate stood next, his voice clipped and proper. "Your Honor, we must consider that this woman fled a legal marriage and shot her husband, and that Mr. McCrae engaged in unlawful killing on his own property." Elias didn't let the judge answer first. He stepped forward, tired and battered but unshaken. "That man owned fear," Elias said, "not a wife. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a simple truth spoken from a place too deep to question." A hush fell. Even the old judge, who'd presided over Red Hollow's justice longer than most, had lived, leaned back as if the weight of those words had knocked the wind out of him. The judge reviewed the documents again, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed tight. Then he looked at Mara, then Elias. "The court finds that the marriage contract was not legal under territorial law. Miss Delaney was not a willing party. As for Mr. McCrae, his use of force is deemed self-defense. No charges will be filed." The silence held a moment longer, then broke not with applause or gasps, but with something quieter, the sound of release, of people finally exhaling. The estate of Silas Harden would be seized and liquidated. The ill-gotten gains would be used to pay off debts Silas had manipulated and restore stolen land to rightful hands. Justice, the judge said, might be late, but it had not forgotten how to walk. Mara didn't move for several seconds. Then she looked at Elias. Her hand found his, and this time, when her lips curled into a smile, it wasn't because she had to. It was because she could. Outside, the sky had begun to soften with the approach of dusk. Snow flurries danced lightly over the rooftops. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed and the forge rang with the sound of a blacksmith returning to his craft. Red Hollow wasn't clean. It wasn't pure. But that day, something inside it had been mended. And in that courthouse, for the first time in years, a woman who had once been traded like property, and a man who'd lost everything he thought mattered, stood hand in hand not as victims or saviors, but as survivors. Some endings don't come with trumpets or crowds. Sometimes, they arrive quietly on a porch swing, under the breath of spring, where two people who never planned to love find themselves making room for more than just survival. The cabin had changed. Not in its bones, it still creaked when the wind came in from the north, and the roof still sighed under early morning dew, but in its soul. The firewood was stacked taller now, neatly arranged by Elias and left to dry in the sun. The front porch, once gray and cracked, had been sanded and repainted with slow, deliberate care. A little garden had sprouted near the back, rows of green stubbornly rising through thawed earth, as if refusing to remember the snow. It had been 4 months since Red Hollow. Spring had settled in like a long exhale, and with it came the quiet rhythm of days unburdened by fear. Mara walked slower now, her belly full and round beneath loose cotton dresses, hands often resting on her growing child, as if steadying the future itself. She spent her mornings in the garden, tending herbs and beans, humming old melodies she didn't remember learning. In the afternoons, she sat in the sun with a book or needle and thread, stitching tiny clothes from old shirts and curtains Elias insisted he didn't miss. The baby's cradle, carved by Elias himself, sat by the fireplace, unfinished but beautiful in its intention. Elias had taken to routine, as if his body had waited years to be still. He chopped wood, repaired fences, oiled saddles that no longer carried war, and when Mara asked, he taught her to shoot not out of fear, but for the simple dignity of knowing she could. No one should feel helpless again, he'd said, placing the rifle in her hands. Least of all you. She never fired to kill, only to understand. One warm morning, as birds chirped in pine branches above, Mara laid a bundle of tiny shirts out on the porch rail. Elias sat behind her on the swing, one boot gently nudging the floor. The air smelled of cedar and earth. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Mara looked down at the shirt in her lap. "Micah?" she said. Elias glanced up. "Micah?" She nodded. "It means, who is like God? It's strong, gentle." He watched her for a long second. "Micah Elias Delaney." Mara smiled. And Elias, hearing his name spoken in a way that made it part of something larger, swallowed hard. Samuel would have liked that, he said. They hadn't spoken of his brother much. The pain was still there, like a scar you forget until your shirt brushes against it just right. But this wasn't pain. This was something else, a quiet honoring, a weaving of what had been lost into what was coming. As the sun climbed higher, the sounds of morning gave way to the lull of early afternoon. Bees hovered over blossoms. A squirrel chattered somewhere in the trees. The swing creaked gently beneath their weight. Elias looked over at Mara. Her eyes were closed now, face tilted toward the sun. He thought about how far they'd come from smoke curling out of a chimney that wasn't supposed to be there, to this porch, this child, this peace. He had bought the cabin with the intention of being alone, of growing old in silence. But life had other plans. Plans with dark nights and gunfire, with long talks by firelight, with healing that came not as a wave, but as a slow turning of the soil. He didn't know if they'd ever go back to Red Hollow. They still owned the land. Sheriff Mathers wrote often, telling them how the council had shifted, how Silas's influence had rotted more than roots. But Elias didn't miss it. Not the town, not the weight. The cabin was enough. The woman beside him was more than enough. Mara stirred and opened her eyes. She smiled at him, slow and unhurried. He kicked, she whispered. Elias leaned forward, hand reaching gently to rest on her belly. There it was, faint but certain, a flutter, like a heartbeat in the wind. He laughed then, not loudly, not like a man winning something, but like a man remembering what joy felt like after forgetting it for too long. It had been years since that sound had passed his lips without effort, years since it had come from something other than relief or disbelief. Now, it came from love. Sometimes, life doesn't fall apart, it falls into place, in ways we never expected. Elias McCrae thought he was buying solitude, a place to bury his grief. Instead, he found someone who had also been broken by the world, yet refused to let it define her. Together, they didn't erase the pain, they honored it, faced it, and slowly built something stronger in its place. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always arrive loudly. It comes quietly through kindness shared at a kitchen table, through standing up when it would be easier to walk away, through choosing love even after loss. Mara didn't need rescuing, she needed someone who believed her worth was more than what had been taken from her. Elias didn't need another battle, he needed a reason to hope again. No matter how late in life it may feel, there is still room for redemption, still time for a new beginning. Even in the most remote corners of the world, or the heart love can grow where pain once settled. If you carry old wounds, remember, peace is possible. And sometimes, it starts with simply opening a door you were once afraid to knock on. Absolutely. Here's a short and heartfelt outro message with a call to action. Thank you for spending your time with us and walking through this journey of courage, loss, and healing. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more powerful stories from the untamed frontiers of the past. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive. See you in the next story.